and I have no memory as to what that ghost did with me. The next thing that happened is that when I woke up, it was somewhere around 11 p.m. Then when I looked around in the room in which I was in, I saw that there was a lot of herbs and things like that. And I realized that in this house in which I had found myself, this house, it belonged to a traditional healer. By the moment that I woke up, then my mother started crying as she was holding me. As my mother was crying, she then told me that I had received a spiritual attack from a goblin called Rishiri. In bracket, this type of a goblin, it is in form of a bird. Most of the people that send out these spiritual attacks, most of them are witches that use this type of a goblin. It will be in form of a bird. When you receive this type of a spiritual attack, you can just hear as if a bird will be flying just above your head. That is why it is called Rishiri. So as my mom was telling me that I had received this spiritual attack, I then saw that the traditional healer who had been assisting me, he then got so angry that he started hitting the floor with his walking stick. Then he pointed his walking stick in the direction of my mother, and he angrily said at my mother, "You woman, you have to tell your child the truth, for she deserves to know the truth." That is when my father and my mother started to tell me everything that had happened to my auntie from the day that she went missing. My father then told me that the day that my auntie went to South Africa, what she did not know is that my father and his younger brother, they had hired these men that we call Mabinya, those men that are used by ritualists. Whenever a witch doctor or a ritualist want to harvest human body parts, they hire these men that are not afraid to kill a human being and then harvest the body parts. So my auntie, whilst she was on the truck thinking that she was on her way going to South Africa to sell her doilies, what she didn't know is that on that same night she was going to be murdered, and then her body parts were going to be harvested. When she had arrived and when she was dropped off in Masvingo, she then went to the hiking spot as usual. But by the time that she went to the hiking spot, then a car stopped for her. When she got into that car, what she didn't know is that the people whom she was riding with in that same car, the car belonged to those men who were going to end her life and to harvest her body parts. And all along, my father and his younger brother, they were just following that car behind, and my auntie, she didn't even know that my father and his younger brother, they were following her. And at that time, my father was used this type of a car that was only used by very rich people. It was called a Pajero. So my father told me that after our auntie had been murdered, they then loaded some of the body parts that they had been told to bring by that traditional healer who was assisting them with the money-making rituals. So after our auntie had been murdered, they then proceeded to dump her body. But as for my parents, they all died without ever telling me where exactly they dumped our auntie's dead body. So those men that had been hired by my father and his younger brother, those men, they were also on their way going to South Africa. According to my father, he said that they had this other traditional healer who was there in South Africa, whom they used to sell human body parts to. On that trip, in the boot of their car, they had the head of this other little boy whom they had murdered, and they had also harvested his body parts, and they were going to resell those body parts there in South Africa to this other witch doctor. So after those men that had been hired by my father and his younger brother to murder their own sister, after they were done murdering her, then they started dividing her body parts amongst themselves. Then my father told me that those men then took some body parts from her dead body, those body parts that they wanted to go and sell in South Africa. As for my father and his younger brother, he then took some of the body parts as they were instructed by the witch doctor who was assisting them at that time. My father refused to tell me the place where this crime took place. He never told me. Even until he passed away, he never wanted to tell me the place where this whole thing happened. My father said that they then took those body parts after they had finished dividing them. Then they loaded those body parts that had belonged to his sister. They loaded it in the Pajero that he was driving. Then they returned back home with those body parts. Then they went straight to that witch doctor who was assisting them at that time. Then that traditional healer managed to raise up the spirit that belonged to my auntie. When they raised up the spirit that belonged to my auntie, then my father, my mother, and my father's younger brother, they all started using my auntie's spirit in their business. So whenever my auntie will be busy working, so money will be flowing in their business. My late auntie's spirit was the one that was calling in a lot of customers, as well at my mother's several flea markets. She was the one who used to call a lot of customers so that they can come and buy at her several flea markets. As well, at my father's younger brother's business, my father and his younger brother, they had their trucks. So my late auntie's spirit was the one that was being used as a sacrifice in all of those businesses. When my father and my mother and I returned from that place where they had taken me, then they started to give me a lot of different herbs. So they will give me these herbs sometimes to eat, then sometimes they would mix those herbs so that I can drink those herbs. Whenever they will be giving me those herbs, they will tell me that the purpose of them giving me all of those herbs, it was so that I won't panic whenever I would see my auntie's ghost. My father and my mother had started giving me all of those herbs that they were giving me. Sometimes I would just get into the house, then I will see my auntie's ghost doing whatever she was doing, and I was no longer afraid of her. When my father passed away at that time, his businesses, they were going down. After the death of my father, that was when my mother and my father's younger brother, the one who was also a ritualist, then they told me that they wanted to have a meeting with me. When I went to that meeting, then my mother and my father's younger brother, they told me that they had chosen me so that I can continue with the work of being a ritualist that had been left behind by my father. Dear listeners, right there was a part 2 to that message that I received. Then we had to translate this message. Strange things do happen in this world.